Clean Energy Canada has released a new study about Canada's electricity system called Underneath It All. And basically what it says is if we're headed for an electric future, Canada's electricity system is not ready. In fact, we're really not ready. And we need to remedy that if we want to be prosperous and competitive in the future. So I'm going to talk to Mark Zacharias, who's a visiting professor at Simon Fraser's University School of Public Policy and one of the authors of the study. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Great, thank you very much. Good to be here.
Look, you're really pitching on our wheelhouse because we've been arguing this for a couple of years at Energy Media. And if you look out into the future, everything is going to be electrified, and what isn't electrified will be using low carbon fuels like hydrogen, perhaps, which will probably be made with electricity. So how do we communicate to the Canadian public that the backbone, the very foundation of the economy that we want to, our kids are going to have, our grandkids, has got to be the electricity system?
Well, I think there's several points to that question. The first one is Canada is incredibly well situated right now globally to seize on an advantage to produce clean electricity and clean power. Right now, 83% of our grid is non-emitting. Compare that to the US, which is 37%. And that's a tremendous opportunity. And the reason it is an opportunity for Canada is as our biggest trading partners, be it the EU, the UK, US, and some of the Asian countries, start looking at the carbon intensity of the products that they allow to cross into their borders, low carbon products are going to have an advantage. And Canada already has some of the lowest carbon products in the world, be it some of our fertilizers, forest products, metals, minerals, smelted minerals, steel, cement. We have an opportunity here to not only move that 83% to 100% by 2035, which allows us access into particularly EU markets that want cleaner goods, but also it's a good stepping stone to get Canada to net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050. And that'll put Canada among the leading nations globally around decarbonizing our entire economy and providing a competitive advantage.
Now, I've interviewed economist Chris Bataille a few times about the issue of how much more electricity we're going to need by 2050. His take, and I think it's in that in amongst his colleagues, is that advanced economies like Canada will need 2 to 3 times the electricity by then, and less advanced economies 4 to 5 times. And building generation capacity, doubling it or tripling it, is a tremendous task. What are your thoughts on that, about how we can do that?
Well, we tend to agree with Chris and others that it's around 2, maybe 3 times more electricity required by 2050. Canada has a number of ways to get there. One is we are number 2 in the world from a new study that just came out in the journal Nature in October for our ability to meet our energy needs from wind and solar. And so that's kind of a new piece of information that most people haven't seen around. Canada is really well positioned to develop and produce renewables, particularly at low costs. I mean, Alberta and Saskatchewan right now are producing some of the low cost renewable power in North America and have the ability to scale up in a large way. The second thing Canada has going for it is that as we add more renewable power to our grid, there are storage scale opportunities now appearing around the world that are huge. There are batteries being set up and constructed right now in Southern Australia, another one's going into Saudi Arabia, that are 1.2 and 1.3 gigawatts of storage. That's about the same size as Muskrat Falls and BC Site C in terms of capacity. So there is an opportunity now that didn't exist even 5 years ago to store some of these energy. We also have opportunities for things like rooftop solar across Canada. We have many parts of Canada that have great solar conditions. We have opportunities for biomass where you capture the carbon that comes off the biomass. Again, we are a large hydro producer. We're the 6th largest energy producer in the world right now. So we have opportunities across Canada to kind of help step up that generation. And we're probably in much better shape than most nations worldwide.
Now, one of the options, and you have a strong recommendation in this report on this point, but one of the options for generating new electricity is First Nations entrepreneurship. So there are, they got 197 renewable energy, Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in BC alone. Tell us a little bit more about the opportunity there for Indigenous communities.
Well, we've been working with Indigenous Clean Energy, which are a national organization that works with Indigenous nations that are interested in clean energy projects. And, they've provided us a bunch of information for the report showing that there is not only kind of interest and desire across Canada from nations to stand up these resources in their communities, it also allows them to be energy independent. And right now, a lot of these nations, the rural remote ones, are often still on diesel, and there are funds from the federal government to get them off of diesel generation. But they also have an opportunity not only to make their own communities energy independent, but also to sell into the grid. And I think a lot of more smarter proponents and savvy proponents now are realizing that Indigenous consent is required to stand up projects across Canada, and they're starting to work in partnership with a lot of nations. And there are some already large projects up and running. Interjex is in partnership with a number of nations with some wind farms that are up to around 300 megawatts in size right now. So it's already happening.
Right. Well, let's talk about one of these potential sources of electricity, which is nuclear, and that is very controversial. It's got, as I know from my social media accounts, passionate opponents and proponents. And I've interviewed a number of folks about this, and there, maybe in the 2030s, nuclear might be feasible, like small modular reactors. It might be cost effective, but it really seems to be up in the air right now.
I totally agree. And the jury is out on nuclear right now. I mean, what is known is Canada is one of the few nuclear powers in the world that has the capacity and expertise and history of standing up new generation. We are a nuclear power, and we have been for a long, long time. So that's kind of in the good category. In the unknown category is we don't know what the costs are going to be to stand up new nuclear. If you look worldwide, there are a number of plans to build new nuclear plants, but again, often they're shelved because the costs are so prohibitive. Also, too, is we have costs of wind and solar in Canada that are approaching 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And those costs keep declining. And as long as those costs keep declining on renewable energy generation, along with storage, that also is cheaper and cheaper over the long run. It's really unsure right now whether there is a future for nuclear energy in Canada. I agree with you. Yes, there are small modular reactors being planned. I think the earliest one to stand up is going to be in Ontario around 2028, and Canada has the expertise in developing these, but it's really unsure, one, what the costs are going to be, and two, whether the public is going to accept these showing up in their communities. So it really is yet to be seen. I know there are 6 or 7 companies worldwide working on small modular reactors right now. So whether those get to market and kind of who is first to market is also going to be interesting to see, just how competitive Canada can be in this space.
Let's talk about export potential, because on the one hand, there's certainly plenty of opportunity in the US, where, as you mentioned, 37% of their grid is decarbonized. The rest still a lot of coal and natural gas. But Quebec has demonstrated how difficult that can be. They just had their transmission project down to the New England turned down by, I think it was by Maine. They had a referendum. It was amongst Maine voters. So any thoughts on how those kinds of issues get resolved?
Yeah, so I mean, first, we export about 8% of our electricity right now. We generate in Canada into the US, and those go across 34 different transmission lines that swing across the border. And so yes, the US, particularly under the Biden administration, they floated the idea of a clean electricity standard by 2035, which would have the US grid fully non-emitting by 2035. Now, whether Biden's administration is able to put that into play or not, it's really unclear, but at least the intention and the ambition is there, which is good. So that's kind of the first thing. Second one is, Exporting electricity is not just stringing wires across the border. We have an opportunity in Canada to produce clean hydrogen, often called green hydrogen, which is where you take electricity and water and you use electrolysis to make green hydrogen. There was a study out of Harvard, I think in 2018, that showed that Canada was among the cheapest nations and the most competitive nations worldwide in producing green hydrogen and shipping that to market. And it's turned into mostly ammonia, and then that can be moved into particularly Asian markets where it can be used to supplant or replace natural gas. So there are a number of different ways there. On the main issue, I think, that was one project at one time, but overall, I think you're going to see a more and more demand from the US for cheap, affordable, reliable, clean power exports, and they are going to be looking to Canada.
Well, on the topic of transmission, your study mentions the Pan-Canadian Grid Council, which is the Liberals proposed that during the recent federal election campaign. And I'm wondering how you see this grid council working, because of course, in Canada, the provinces have jurisdiction over electricity production and transmission, unless it crosses a border. And they don't play well with each other often, and they certainly don't play well with the federal government on this particular topic.
So you're absolutely right that provinces have authority and constitutional jurisdiction over generation, but the federal government's pretty important, and it's important in three ways. First, it has the ability to require electricity generation to be clean. So much like the federal government did with coal electricity generation a couple of years ago, phasing out all coal generation by 2030, the same can be done with generation overall by 2035. So the federal government has important regulatory powers in that space. So that's kind of the first thing the federal government can do. The second thing the federal government can do is convene. It can bring together provinces, territories, utilities, indigenous nations, industry stakeholders, municipalities together, actually to find out what are those regional pathways to 2035 and 2050, and how do you get there? And they've done some work in this space already over the last couple of years. I think the most fruitful conversations have been the Atlantic Loop. So trying to string power from Labrador and displace fossil fuel generation in the Maritimes, and that work and those conversations are underway. So that's the second way they can do it. The third way the federal government can help is actually investing in infrastructure and innovation. On the infrastructure piece, there is going to be the need for more transmission across and between provinces to share loads and share energy sources, particularly for provinces like the Prairie provinces and the Maritimes that are going to need to phase out coal and natural gas generation. Also, too, the federal government, they have a big role in the innovation space. We have leading Canadian companies like HydroStore, which is compressed air storage. We have General Fusion. We are a clean tech leader worldwide, and those investments in those Canadian companies can help us actually meet our 2035 and 2050 goals. So an important place for the federal government in all of those conversations.
Just to finish, kind of wrap up our conversation, Mark, I think we should draw attention to the fact that the power sector, the electricity sector, is really being in the process of being transformed globally. I mean, if you look down in the US, for instance, you see all sorts of new technologies around, that are basically forcing utilities to revamp, re-engineer their business models. They're developing more markets so that people, prosumers, you can generate electricity on your rooftop, sell it into the market. You can do all sorts of things that you can't do in Canada, outside of maybe of Alberta. And that's only just the beginning. Technology is literally transforming this particular sector, and it doesn't get a lot of public attention, but that is a tremendous opportunity, it seems to me, for Canada to grab the opportunity afforded by that technology change and to get to where we need to be. So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mentioned quickly HydroStore based out of Toronto. They have two projects in California right now that will be 1 gigawatt of storage, so 1,000 megawatts, about the same as Site C or Muskrat Falls together. And that's for storage that's 8 to 12 hours. So unlike batteries, which are often 4 to 6 hours and then run out of power and you have to recharge them, these companies are looking at storage that's going to rival some of the base load that you would see from things like hydro. So I think a tremendous opportunity there. You mentioned markets. We didn't go into electricity markets in our report, but it's going to be a game changer. So right now we have a number of federated silos and utilities across Canada, for example. And what's worked to date isn't going to work in the future. So you need provinces and utilities to quickly start thinking about, how do we scale up our power? How do we double the amount of electricity generated in the next 28 years and get those through all the regulatory processes? And while doing so, keeping the ratepayer safe from giant increases, and like we've seen what's going on in Europe right now, and also making sure that the grid is reliable, affordable, and we can scale up and attract new industries to Canada. So I think Canadian companies are ideally positioned in this space. I think we noted in the report that Brookfield Renewables is one of the largest owner-operator of renewable energy assets across the world right now. So it's not like we have to grow our companies. We're already on the map and we're here. And we have Canadian companies that are actually playing across the world in this space.
Well, Mark, this conversation has to be had in the public square, because a lot of what you talked about will require governments to act in some capacity, and governments only can go so fast. They can't get too far out in front of the voters, and so the voters need to be educated on what's happening in the electricity system and what needs to happen. And I think your report is a good start on maybe kickstarting that conversation at a national level in Canada. So thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you very much.